Have you ever noticed that the strongest women rarely argue before they leave? They don't always slam doors, demand closure, or announce their final decision. Instead, there comes a moment when something inside them quietly changes. From the outside, it feels sudden and mysterious. But beneath the surface, that decision has been forming for weeks, months, or even years. Today, we're exploring one of the most misunderstood behaviors in human psychology, why strong empath women walk away without warning, and why their silence often says more than 1,000 arguments ever could. This isn't about revenge, manipulation, or emotional games. It's about understanding what happens when empathy reaches its limit. Strong empath women often give more chances than anyone realizes. They observe, forgive, adapt, and hope things will improve. But when the emotional cost becomes greater than the emotional reward, their mind begins to make a decision long before anyone else notices. By the time they physically leave, they've already emotionally detached. Understanding this process reveals powerful truths about boundaries, emotional intelligence, and human behavior. Today, we'll break down the hidden psychological patterns behind this silent departure. You'll discover why people often mistake kindness for weakness, why emotional exhaustion changes the brain's decision-making process, and why the quietest goodbye is often the most permanent one. Whether you recognize these traits in yourself or someone close to you, this lesson may completely change the way you understand relationships, resilience, and the true strength of an empath. Many people assume that strong empath women leave because of one dramatic event, one cruel sentence, or one unforgettable betrayal. In reality, that is rarely how it happens. Their decision is usually built from countless quiet moments that most people overlook. It begins with small disappointments, repeated misunderstandings, broken promises, and emotional neglect that slowly accumulate over time. Because empath women naturally seek harmony, they often dismiss these experiences at first. They tell themselves that everyone has difficult days, that relationships require patience, and that love means understanding another person's flaws. Instead of reacting immediately, they absorb the emotional weight, hoping that compassion and consistency will eventually inspire change. This willingness to understand others is one of their greatest strengths, but it can also become the reason they remain in unhealthy situations far longer than most people would expect. Rather than confronting every issue, they quietly analyze patterns. They notice whether apologies lead to genuine improvement or simply become another cycle. They observe actions more carefully than words, paying attention to subtle shifts in behavior that others may never recognize. Every ignored feeling, every moment of being taken for granted, and every instance where their emotional needs are dismissed adds another invisible layer to an already heavy burden. What makes this breaking point so difficult for others to recognize is that empath women often continue showing kindness while internally questioning everything. They still offer support, they still listen, and they still try to preserve peace. To an outside observer, everything appears normal. Friends, family, or partners may believe the relationship is stable because there are no explosive arguments or dramatic confrontations. Yet beneath that calm surface, something profound is changing. Their emotional investment begins to shrink. The hope that once motivated endless patience slowly fades as reality replaces expectation. Strong empath women rarely measure relationships by isolated incidents. They measure them by repeated emotional patterns. They ask themselves whether they feel emotionally safe, respected, valued, and understood. When the answer continues to be no, despite repeated effort, their perspective quietly transforms. Instead of asking how they can save the relationship, they begin asking how they can save themselves. That internal shift is the true beginning of the silent breaking point. It is not fueled by anger, but by clarity. The emotional energy that once flowed toward fixing others gradually redirects toward protecting their own peace, their mental well-being, and the parts of themselves they have sacrificed for far too long. One of the most misunderstood behaviors of a strong empath woman is her decision to stop explaining herself. To many people, this silence seems cold, confusing, or even unfair. They wonder why someone who was once so open, patient, and communicative suddenly has nothing left to say. The answer is rarely found in a single conversation. It is hidden within a long history of conversations that produced little change. Every heartfelt discussion, every vulnerable confession, and every attempt to express her needs was often met with excuses, defensiveness, temporary promises, or complete misunderstanding. Over time, she begins to recognize a painful truth. Repeating the same message to someone who refuses to truly hear it only creates deeper exhaustion. Strong empath women are naturally inclined toward communication. They believe that honesty can heal misunderstandings and that empathy can bridge emotional distance. They are usually willing to explain not only what they feel, but also why they feel it. They try different words, different tones, and different moments, hoping that one conversation will finally create understanding. They often give far more emotional clarity than they ever receive in return. Instead of assuming bad intentions, they search for reasons behind another person's behavior, offering patience where others might have already walked away. Eventually, however, a pattern begins to reveal itself. They notice that while their words are heard, they are not truly understood. Their emotions are acknowledged but rarely respected. Their concerns are listened to but quickly forgotten. The same issues continue repeating despite countless discussions. This repetition slowly changes the purpose of communication. Instead of feeling like a path toward connection, every new explanation starts to feel like proof that nothing is changing. What was once an act of hope becomes an act of emotional depletion. This is the point where silence begins to replace explanation. It is not meant to punish anyone or create mystery. It reflects an internal realization that understanding cannot be forced. Genuine change requires willingness from both people, not endless emotional labor from only one. A strong empath woman understands that explaining herself for the 20th time will not suddenly produce a different result if the previous 19 conversations led nowhere. She becomes more protective of her emotional energy, choosing to invest it where it has the possibility of being valued instead of repeatedly dismissed. To outsiders, her silence may appear sudden, but internally it represents the final stage of a process that has been unfolding for a long time. She has already spoken through her honesty, her patience, her tears, her forgiveness, and her repeated attempts to create mutual understanding. When those efforts consistently fail, silence becomes less about giving up on another person and more about refusing to abandon herself. Her quietness is not caused by a lack of words, but by the realization that words lose their meaning when they are met with the same unchanged patterns again and again. One of the biggest misconceptions about strong empath women is the belief that they leave on impulse. To those watching from the outside, their departure can seem sudden, unexpected, and impossible to understand. One day they appear caring, attentive, and emotionally present, and the next they are gone without looking back. What many people fail to realize is that the physical act of leaving is often the final chapter of a story that has already unfolded inside their mind. Long before they pack a bag, end a conversation, or close a relationship, they have been quietly processing every emotional experience that led them to that decision. Strong empath women naturally invest deeply in the people they love. They don't form emotional bonds casually, and they don't abandon them casually either. They spend an extraordinary amount of time trying to repair what is broken. They replay conversations in their minds, searching for better ways to communicate. They question themselves before questioning others. They ask whether they could have been more patient, more understanding, or more forgiving. This intense self-reflection often delays their decision because they genuinely want to believe that healing is still possible. As time passes, however, something subtle begins to change. The emotional connection that once felt effortless starts requiring constant effort to maintain. What once brought joy now creates anxiety. Conversations become obligations instead of opportunities for closeness. Acts of kindness begin to feel one-sided. Instead of feeling emotionally nourished, they find themselves emotionally drained. This gradual shift is rarely visible because empath women often continue fulfilling their responsibilities while privately carrying the weight of disappointment. They smile when expected, offer encouragement, and maintain routines, even as their emotional attachment quietly weakens. Their mind begins collecting evidence rather than excuses. They stop focusing on isolated incidents and start recognizing consistent behavioral patterns. Every broken promise, every repeated dismissal, and every moment of emotional neglect reinforces a growing realization that love alone cannot sustain a relationship without mutual respect and effort. This recognition does not create immediate action. Instead, it creates emotional distance. They begin protecting parts of themselves that were once freely shared, becoming more reserved not because they no longer care, but because they have learned that constant vulnerability without reciprocity becomes emotionally unsafe. During this stage, they often appear calmer than before. Ironically, the absence of conflict can mislead others into believing that everything has improved. In reality, the opposite is often true. They argue less because they no longer expect different outcomes. They stop trying to convince, persuade, or fix what has repeatedly resisted change. Their energy shifts inward, focusing less on preserving the relationship and more on preserving their own emotional stability. This quiet transformation is difficult to detect because it happens beneath ordinary conversations and familiar routines. By the time a strong empath woman physically walks away, much of the emotional separation has already taken place. The grief has already been felt in private moments. The disappointment has already been processed through countless nights of reflection. The hope that once kept her holding on has gradually been replaced by acceptance. What appears to others as a sudden goodbye is often the visible expression of an invisible journey that has been unfolding for months or even years, shaped not by a single painful moment but by the steady accumulation of unmet emotional needs, repeated patterns, and the quiet realization that protecting her inner peace has become more important than remaining in a connection that no longer allows her to thrive. For a strong empath woman, setting boundaries is not something that comes naturally in the beginning. Many are raised to believe that kindness means always being available, that love means endless sacrifice, and that understanding others should come before protecting themselves. Because of this mindset, they often become the emotional support system for everyone around them. They listen without interruption, comfort without hesitation, forgive without keeping score, and continue giving even when their own emotional reserves are running dangerously low. Their compassion becomes so dependable that others may begin to see it as something permanent rather than something precious. The challenge begins when generosity is mistaken for unlimited access. Some people grow comfortable receiving emotional support without offering the same care in return. They expect patience but rarely practice it. They seek understanding while showing very little of it themselves. Over time, this imbalance creates a relationship where one person constantly gives while the other continually takes. Because empath women naturally avoid conflict, they may tolerate this imbalance far longer than is healthy, convincing themselves that things will eventually become more equal if they simply remain patient. As emotional exhaustion grows, They begin noticing something they once ignored. Every time they say yes when they truly want to say no, they feel a little further away from themselves. Every unnecessary compromise chips away at their confidence. Every ignored intuition leaves them questioning why they continue placing someone else's comfort above their own well being. These realizations are rarely dramatic. They emerge slowly through repeated experiences, encouraging them to examine the true cost of constantly neglecting their own needs. This growing awareness changes the way they define love and compassion. They begin to understand that genuine kindness does not require self-abandonment. Supporting others should never demand the loss of personal peace, emotional stability, or self-respect. They recognize that healthy relationships thrive not because one person endlessly sacrifices, but because both people contribute, listen, respect limits, and value each other's emotional needs equally. This shift marks a profound transformation in how they interact with the world around them. Boundaries are often misunderstood as walls meant to keep people out, but for a strong empath woman, they function more like doors with locks. They decide who is welcomed into their emotional world, how much access each person receives, and what behaviors are no longer acceptable. Instead of feeling guilty for protecting their time and energy, they begin seeing boundaries as acts of self-respect. They no longer apologize for needing space, declining unreasonable demands, or stepping away from relationships that consistently leave them emotionally depleted. As these boundaries become stronger, their entire presence begins to change. They become calmer because they are no longer carrying responsibilities that never belonged to them. They become more confident because their decisions are guided by self-awareness rather than fear of disappointing others. They stop seeking validation from people who only appreciated them when they had no limits. The same compassion that was once directed almost entirely toward others is finally extended inward, allowing them to protect their peace, honor their emotional needs, and recognize that the strongest form of empathy includes the courage to care for themselves with the same devotion they have always offered everyone else. Perhaps the most powerful and misunderstood aspect of a strong empath woman's journey is the silence that follows her decision to leave. Many people expect dramatic farewells, emotional confrontations, or endless attempts to reopen the conversation. They assume that if someone truly cared, they would continue explaining, negotiating, or fighting for another chance. But when a strong empath woman reaches her limit, her silence is rarely an act of punishment. It is the natural result of a decision that has already been carefully considered, emotionally processed, and deeply accepted. By the time she chooses silence, she has often exhausted every other path she believed could save the relationship. Throughout the relationship, she usually communicated more than people realize. She expressed her concerns, revealed her fears, shared her hopes, and gave countless opportunities for change. She believed that honesty could strengthen trust and that mutual understanding could repair emotional distance. Even when conversations became difficult, she often chose patience over pride, hoping that consistency would eventually create lasting improvement. Every sincere effort represented another chance for the relationship to become healthier. Every conversation carried the quiet hope that both people would grow together rather than drift apart. When those efforts repeatedly fail, something important changes inside her. She no longer feels the need to convince someone of her value or explain pain that has already been described many times before. She recognizes that understandings cannot be forced upon someone who has consistently chosen not to listen. Instead of investing more emotional energy into repeating the same truths, she begins directing that energy toward rebuilding herself. Her focus shifts away from changing another person's behavior and toward restoring the peace she gradually lost while trying to make the relationship work. This silence is often confusing because it arrives without anger. There are no dramatic speeches, no endless accusations, and no desire to prove who was right or wrong. The emotional storms that once fueled difficult conversations have settled into quiet certainty. She understands that closure does not always come from receiving perfect answers or hearing the apology she once hoped for. Sometimes closure comes from accepting reality exactly as it is without trying to reshape it into something different. Many people mistake this calmness for indifference, but the opposite is often true. Her silence is valuable precisely because it was earned through countless emotional battles that no one else fully witnessed. Every sleepless night, every internal debate, every moment of self doubt, and every attempt to preserve the connection shaped the quiet confidence she now carries. She no longer measures her worth by another person's recognition, approval, or willingness to change. Instead, she trusts her own observations, honors her own emotional needs, and accepts that protecting her peace is not selfish but necessary. When a strong empath woman chooses silence after walking away, that silence becomes her clearest message. It reflects a heart that has stopped pleading, a mind that has stopped negotiating, and a spirit that has finally chosen self respect over endless sacrifice. The absence of words is not the absence of meaning. It is the strongest evidence that she has already said everything that truly mattered, accepted everything she could no longer control, and found the strength to let her actions speak where her words no longer could.